Here we go, my friends. Lumber prices and flatbed demand today on the Logistics Life. Welcome back, everybody. Data Day today, Dean. Welcome. We're just coming off of Canada Day, and then we got obviously the 4th coming up this week. So a very short week, like we talked about last week. Probably 2.5 days of shipping this week. So for all of you out there that have a ton of loads moving, remember security, because there is going to be some serious criminal activity this week. But today, we are not talking about that. Today, we are talking about lumber prices, flatbed markets, and the building industry as a whole. Dean, what do we got, buddy? I know yesterday on your IQ show, there was some wicked information about this.
Yeah, we were headline caught my attention this week, and it was in the Wall Street Journal on Monday, and it was talking about it's the home building season, but no one is buying lumber, and it got me thinking about our discussions about lumber and you building things out of steel during the pandemic because we couldn't buy any lumber. We did a renovation during the pandemic, and I've still got a pile of lumber out there in my backyard covered in tarps because the builders ordered too much, but it's worth about $5,000, and it's sitting there kind of, I think, degrading, but it's dimension framing lumber that's used in the building industry. And so it just got me thinking about this headline. It said that lumber futures had dropped about 27% since March. And you and I remember we were talking about lumber prices during the pandemic. And I think a lumber future contract is a 90 ton rail carload delivered in Vancouver is like the futures contract definition. So that's what they're talking about. But we were talking about $1,500 a board feet per board feet. It's down to maybe $400 to $452 now. So it's dropped from $1,500 per board, 1,000 board feet to $452. And of course, what that's meant is that the price of the 2x4s, which is a pretty good indicator of the housing market, is absolutely tanking. So they're dropping way down, and that really doesn't bode well for, I think, the flatbed industry, Dan. I think that's the biggest concern I've got. We talked about it last week's show where tractor machinery sales are way down. Steel production, we're past the peak of that. Steel production's down about 5% year over year. But what we're seeing now is this fairly big slide in dimension framing lumber, which flatbed carriers would haul. Dustin Jalbert was on our show, and he said one of the best indicators is the results from Home Depot and Lowe's, because about 40% of lumber demand, right, is repairs and remodeling.
Yes.
Not building new homes, because we know building of new homes has slowed way down because of high interest rates. But he said even repairs and remodeling has cooled way down because a lot of the projects that we brought forward during the pandemic, because we were home, remember those discussions, and building decks and sheds and all those things, that's kind of stopped. They were one-off projects. So what we're seeing now is this big fall off in demand because repair and remodeling has slowed down, which is almost half of truckload demand for lumber. And then on the other side, single family homes aren't being built at anywhere near the rate that we would have thought they would have been built. We still built, let's be clear, we still built at 982,000 single family homes. That was only 30,000 fewer than this time last year. Right, so it's still
30,000 homes is a lot.
It's a lot.
When you talk about product and material and labor and work, and it's a lot.
It's about 18,000 fewer flatbed loads and about 4,500 fewer dry van loads. So if you work on a 3 flatbed loads per home and 1 for a dry van, so to put that into context, right? So single family home starts, did drop. There's no question they did drop. The numbers weren't good in May. But to put it into context, Dan, compared to, say, our last really big flatbed year, it was 12,000 homes more than 2018 in May. and it was 124,000 homes more than May of 2019. So it's not like it's diabolical. It's just that when you have year over year comparisons like this, things look pretty bad. So I was sort of looking on the positive side when I saw the May numbers come out, and I thought, yeah, we've still got a lot more flatbed volumes than 18. The problem is we've got a lot more trucks than 2018 also that
Yeah.
are compressing demand. So, but this is a pretty big warning sign. Our guest on our show yesterday really said something that got my attention. They do economic forecasting of lumber prices, and they've been hoping that the Fed drops interest rates and starts to give the market some confidence. He said, "I think he said we've given our forecasts a haircut. I think we may have been a little bit too optimistic about how this market is going to behave the rest of the year." So it was a little bit doom and gloomish from one of the industry experts in the building industry as to where demand is going to go for single family homes, which are the most or the most freight intensive and labor intensive of, when it comes to demand for dimension framing lumber that comes from a lot of sawmills. So you'll be seeing sawmills paring back production, laying people off. There's all sorts of things. It's a great story in the uh, Wall Street Journal. It was talking about prices, and it said the spring rally in futures prices never happened, and it said no one's making money at $452 per board feet. So really interesting stories that are happening in that market. I just Dan, we're already seeing the next 35 days, flatbed line haul rates are going to drop by about 8 cents per mile. They're already in the downswing. Flatbed rates drop about
Mm-hmm.
30 cents a mile from here to October. So we're already seeing that slide. I fear that, if demand really falls away, much more so because the building industry is really hemorrhaging from lack of demand, high interest rates, consumer confidence, that no one's making money out in the building industry at these rates, that we start to see an even more severe effect on the flatbed market, because lumber is a big part of building homes is a big part of truckload demand, not just the
Mm-hmm.
lumber, but carpet, electronics, furniture, all of those things that go into finished homes. So that was the news yesterday. We're seeing a little bit of seasonality in the market, but we're also seeing seasonality on the flatbed side, and that means rates are starting to fall once you get past June.
So it's interesting because I read the same report or the same article from the Wall Street Journal, and immediately I started thinking, well, it's funny because I'm not paying any less money for two by fours. What you just said was really interesting when you were talking about the lumber in your backyard with tarps on
Yep.
it. So I just, not this weekend, the weekend before, just finally used all the wood I bought during the pandemic. And so what I did, and probably like most other people, when I started doing a lot of my projects,
Right.
I would go into Home Depot and there would be like 15 2x4s. And I might only need 7, but I'd buy all 15 because it's like, well, if you need one more and now you're traveling around to 15 different stores. So
Right.
I overbought wood, which is probably what your builder did as well, just to make sure they
Yeah.
had it. Because,
Yeah.
like prior to overbuying, the first time I went out to buy, I remember vividly, I bought exactly what I needed. I mean,
Right.
like literally, I think I had 6 inches to spare. The rule in carpentry is always like 15% more just in
Right.
case. And I remember miscutting one piece. And I was like, now I got to drive 30 minutes out to get one 2x4 to drive 30 minutes back. That 2x4 that was like
Oof,
$6 now cost me
oof.
like $17 because of fuel.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I overbought, and I just actually last weekend threw out all the little pieces because I
Right.
like literally would meticulously stack everything because I didn't want to have to be in that position. So I
Same.
said to my wife, I said, all this wood staying until we are literally put the last piece of wood
Right.
in, and then we know we're good. So I'm wondering if that has a little bit to do with it, where a lot of people overbought probably, and those projects that were
Yeah.
done.
Yeah.
Um, it's interesting because I look at all of the things we've done during the pandemic to make our house, well, for us, more of a resort. kind of thing,
right.
right? Where we can go out back and we can sit down and we can really enjoy and just, because we do use our home more now than we ever have,
Yeah, right. Yeah,
if that
yeah,
makes sense.
yeah, yeah.
Um, when I can tell you based on the subdivision going up near my house, there's a 780 home subdivision going
Right,
up. It's been delayed 4 times.
right, right,
And in those 4 delays, now they're saying November it'll be ready.
right, right.
And I know because it was interest rates. It was, even my wife speaking to the builder, and he's saying, yeah, it's just
Mm,
it's tough. Like these things
mm,
aren't selling out, so we're having to delay. We delayed building because once you put houses on, the taxes are different, and
right.
there's all these implications in the background. But like I don't know. To me, I sit here and I say, okay, we're in Q3 now, beginning of Q3. New quarter, new month, new you.
Yeah,
Um, you know, I think at a certain point there has to be some positivity, or else people are really going to start, like, that mental
right.
side of it is really going to
Absolutely.
start turning.
I
I
think
can
it's
remember. Go ahead.
well, I think it was evidence that exact point was evidenced by the Lowe's earnings call report. Lowe's is sort of that big repair and remodeling place that we go to buy lumber. But it said that customers in their report have been buying fewer discretionary items, also, such as outdoor grills, patio sets, taking on fewer projects like kitchen remodels, um, like painters. It just flows on everywhere. And their sales at Lowe's in the first quarter this year dropped 22 billion, right, in the year compared to a year ago. Sorry, sales dropped from 22 billion a year ago. It was the fifth quarter in a row that Lowe's posted year over year sales decline. So it gives you a sense of how much that market is dropping. Home Depot first quarter results were down 2.3% from last quarter first quarter 23. So you can see that the earnings of those big players in that repair and remodeling market are seeing fewer sales and fewer dollars per sales visit, right? So
So I got a question for you, Dean, on that, because I'm wondering if two things, and maybe I'm thinking too far deep into it. Please tell me if I am. So can we really go year over year for a lot of these companies? Like, we got to think, right?
yeah,
Kind of like trucking companies. If a trucking company looked at what they made during the pandemic to now, it'd be astronomically different, but it was an astronomically different environment. And I'm
right,
wondering if, like, this whole year over year, and I know we do this a lot, but it begs a good point. You go back to the 2018-19 when I met you in 2019, and everybody was saying you can't compare, like, 2018, you got to wipe that year out, right?
right,
Just because,
right,
but now we are comparing it. So
yeah,
I'm wondering because, during the pandemic, and yes, like, call a spade, prices went up, but I bet you profits went up too, right?
right,
Like, just because lumber prices go up, if it goes up a buck, Home Depot is not putting the lumber up a buck. They're putting it up a buck 50 because they still want to make their 50% margin, right?
yeah.
So it's like, I don't know. I'm wondering if a lot of this, earnings are down, earning this, if we go back pre-pandemic, if we're kind of in the same boat, because yes, people built more things, but I mean, you build a deck properly, you don't need to build another deck for 15 years, right?
Right,
You
right,
you build an pergola properly, you don't need to build another pergola for probably 10 years, 15
right,
years, depending on, how,
exactly.
if you just use treated wood or untreated by 10 by 10s and so on and so
Yeah,
forth. So, like, part of me wonders, everybody did all these renovations for their home offices, but now their home office is renovated. Like, I've now got 3 different walls in my office that
right,
I can turn my desk when I feel like I want a different background,
right.
right? So it's I don't know. I mean, I start thinking about it and I'm saying, yes, okay, things are on a decline. But I guess where I'm going with this, Dean, is it's on a decline, but if we're comparing it to profits in a year that maybe were
Still impacted.
inflated,
Still
yeah,
impacted by the pandemic. It's a great point, Dan. Year-over-year comps are always sketchy if you're trying to compare it to an easy or a hard year. It doesn't give you a really good read. So
yeah,
that's why I went back and looked at, produce season numbers are down about 9%, compared to this time last year. We had a lot of wet conditions the early part of the season in California last year. So I went back to 2019. We're about 4% below 2019 levels in terms of the number of truckloads of produce. But again, there's some things happening that are not normal. So what you've got to watch for with year-over-year comps is what's happening this year that didn't happen last year. And with the pandemic, there was stuff that went on for 3 years that really impacted the freight market last year. I wrote a piece last year about explaining 2023, but I had to go back 5 years to do it. Right, because it started really, the seeds were planted in 2018, 2019 because we had a massive overbuy. We had a tariff pull forward because of the Trump tariffs on $200 billion worth of goods from Asia. That inflated volumes in 18, volumes softened in 19 as a result, but the excess capacity came online in 19, and then we started that down cycle that would have continued well past the pandemic had the pandemic not happened. But the disruption in the pandemic was unequal because we're still seeing the effects of that today in a number of markets. The market is still trying to find its footing in terms of behaving normally. And that's why, I take some comfort that it looks a lot like 2018 and 19 cycle did on the upside. Like there is signs that it's starting to return back to normal. But yes, it is odd that a year that we said was extraordinary and unprecedented is actually probably one of the most normal we've seen in the last decade.
I know. It's crazy how it happens. It's insane.
Yeah.
It's insane.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. It's
I think
crazy.
why I wanted to mention that, Dan, is I think if you're in the flatbed business, and you and I have talked about this, there's been a massive decoupling of rates between Toronto and up the Ohio Valley. There's an excess capacity in Canada. Your outbound rates in Canada are way down compared to. I mean, they're even almost lower than 2019 levels. Outbound Canada from Ontario. So there's something going on there that I fear it will add another headwind to flatbed carriers. And when I say flatbed, I mean Conestogas. The roll tights, the coil guys, the galvanized steel guys, the lumber guys, we've already talked about machinery volumes are down. The USDA is predicting that there'll be a 25% drop in on-farm revenue this year because of lower prices, higher cost of fertilizers, all sorts of things. So that's translating to farmers buying fewer machines and implements, which is less to haul for carriers. So if you add in the building industry where we started, the machinery industry, there's a shift in manufacturing going on in Canada, between Canada and the US, that I can't put my finger on just yet, but there's something shifted. Because remember we talked about how if you load out of Toronto to Columbus, you've got to have a load back across the border because of the cabotage laws. But there's nothing going back. Like that's the thing I'm hearing is that there's a decoupling of the volumes because there's something not being manufactured in Canada that used to be manufactured in Canada that required steel from the US or something from the US.
So I do know a lot of OEMs. So my brother-in-law works at a very large robotic welding company.
Right.
And a good friend of ours works at a big OEM, one of the big three, and she's off for 5 months. They furloughed her for 5 months while they retool for electric vehicles.
Right.
Now, here's the kicker in this. My brother-in-law has all these orders from top OEM and companies like Magna and all this, who have now just said, whoop, time out. Right. Put it on hold. And so when I look at that, I say that's probably a big piece of it because the amount of volume, because of the auto manufacturing up here, the amount of volume, like specifically a company like Magna brings in when it comes to steel and dies going north and south, which are typically on flatbeds, Conestogas, roll tights, that kind of stuff. All of that stuff, if there's a retooling going on, they're not being ordered because they're not stamping out new body panels. They're not bringing in steel for new body panels. So or aluminum, whatever, for new body panels. So I look at all of this and I say that probably matches exactly what you're talking about. Yeah. Not to mention, I do think a lot of people retooled 2 years ago
Right.
when things really started declining on dry van side, because dry
Right.
van was the first one that hit bottom and like a dead cat didn't even bounce.
Yep. Yep.
Um, and I look at that and I'm saying they probably retooled. Like, I mean, you sit at the corner of like 15 minutes from my house, there's a Tim Hortons, and you
Yeah.
sit there and have a coffee, and the amount of flatbeds you can count that go by is
Yeah.
crazy,
Right.
crazy. So it's interesting that you say that. I'm gonna have to try and dig into that, see if we can find some information out, because it's like, I mean, I look at it, and every single quarter we have these hopes, these expectations, and they
Right.
just seem to be shattered.
Yeah.
And I mean, I know, obviously, I mean, let's call a spade, right? It's not going to last forever. We've been through these before,
Right.
but
Right.
I think this one is extended
Yeah.
beyond even what 2008, 2009 was,
Yeah.
right? Like, I really think it has, from a freight recession perspective. Like,
Yeah.
I talked to an old customer of mine. He's like, Dan, we are busier now than we've ever been before.
Yeah.
And they do like the home appliances, like the Ninjas and all that kind of stuff.
Right. Right.
And he's like, we are busier than we've ever been before. And so there's these pockets, right, of
Right.
areas that are just massively productive and
Right.
like killing it. And then other areas which are dying, right?
Yeah, so
Like,
I think Dan, the reason I bring up Canada, you've got the Pride Group bankruptcy that had a June 30 stay from the creditors. I haven't read anything about what happened from Saturday to today.
neither
I,
have I. There's been no report so far.
I've got a Google alert set up to hear something about it. I'm kind of surprised. I had a lady call me from Thomson Reuters looking to write a story about what BMO pushed out a little while ago, or Freightwaves reported on BMO's credit write-offs. BMO is a big Canadian bank that lends in the trucking industry, and I just wonder. I've talked to a number of carriers about why rates are so low outbound Toronto and or Ontario, and they simply said it's an oversupply of capacity, and they pointed to this big influx of capacity that came in 2022, which it did everywhere, but it
Yeah,
flooded the market. And I think you've got a particular problem, Dan, because if you're outbound Ontario, you've got to have a load back. It's got to be balanced, right? So you've got to have balanced volumes. If there's an imbalance in volumes, you can see massive rate fluctuations. I mean, on that Ontario um, Ohio River flatbed lane, the spread between the head haul and the back haul is about 10 cents a mile. So it's a fairly tight range up until March last year. And then it just blew apart, and the spread's been about $1 a mile different ever since. And it's on the outbound Toronto lane has been fairly steady, but the backhaul lane rates have dropped way down. So that tells me that there's less volume coming back into Canada, and the carriers are dropping the rates to try and get some market share on that northbound lane back to the what do you call it, the horseshoe region around the lake. They call it something
yeah.
there. So there's something going on, Dan, in Canada where you've got possibly a demand shift, but you also got an excess of capacity that's got to work itself out of the market, and that's just crushing line haul prices at the moment. Even Canada domestic prices seem to have taken a beating.
Yeah, they have. I mean, rates everywhere have taken a beating.
Yeah,
Being,
yeah,
it's, and again, and I know we've talked about this, but it begs to say it again. You know, for everyone out there that's shipping from any location to any location, you have to pay attention to the volumes that go. Like, for example, one of the biggest hits in Canada right now is the Toronto Montreal lane, Montreal Toronto,
yeah,
taking huge hits, huge hits. Now, there's some customers that are still paying very well. Some companies are still making good money. There's some companies in the flatbed that are still up over $1.95 or $2.95 a mile.
right,
So it's like, but you got to look, is it short runs? Is it long runs? Short runs
right,
pay more. And if you don't understand the volumes, the capacity that goes in and out, and the amount of people that are trying to just, make ends meet, if you will. So you talked about, leaving Canada and coming, making sure you have a load coming back home. Most people leave, or sorry, I shouldn't say most. People leave, don't have loads coming home. So they make good money going out, and then
out,
they lose money coming home,
right,
right? This was exactly what happened back in 2019 with a friend of mine that owns a trucking company. he actually parked a third of his fleet and brokered the freight out and made more money than if he actually had the trucks on the road himself.
Right.
And
Right.
so, and it was because what he saw was, good money going out, getting to that location, customers either, having people come in and say, no, I need it at this price now, or blah, blah, blah. Or
Right.
loads getting canceled, having to go to load boards and book spot freight coming home. And the spot freight coming home was paying, 65, 70, 80 cents less a mile,
Right.
which in turn just lost all your revenue you took to go down there, and you come home. So at the end of the trip, you've lost money.
Right.
It's like, why even have the trucks on the road? So it was, furlough drivers. They have a brokerage division. So they started brokering out that freight, made the